Imagine for a moment that you're standing on a hillside in Galilee over 2,000 years ago. The sun shines brightly on the green grass, a gentle breeze brushes against your face, and before you stands a man about to transform the world with his words. He's not a powerful politician, nor a famous philosopher. He is Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, and he is about to deliver the most revolutionary speech in history, the Sermon on the Mount. Now think about this. What makes this sermon so special? Why do we still talk about it 2 millennia later? Get ready, because in the next few minutes we'll dive into the most impactful teachings the world has ever known. Words that challenged empires, transformed hearts, and remain as relevant today as they were when they were first spoken. To understand the impact of the Sermon on the Mount, we need to place ourselves in the perspective of those who heard it for the first time. Imagine a diverse crowd made up of fishermen, farmers, women, children, and even religious leaders, all gathered with a mix of expectation and curiosity. Jesus, seated like a teacher, begins to share words that would turn the world upside down. The sermon opens with the famous Beatitudes, recorded in Matthew 5, verse 3-10. In the very first sentence, Jesus overturns everything the world teaches about happiness and success. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Think about that. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? It's not about material poverty, but about recognizing our spiritual need, our dependence on God. It's admitting that we don't have all the answers and that we need something greater to guide us. It's an invitation to humility, the first step to experiencing God's kingdom here and now. Jesus continues, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." In a world that often pressures us to hide our pain and quickly move on from loss, Jesus validates grief. He reminds us that pain is a part of the human experience and that God is present with us in our suffering. This is not a call to pessimism, but a promise that in God there is comfort for our sorrows. Then he tells us, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." In a culture that values aggression and assertiveness, Jesus invites us to value meekness. Meekness is not weakness, but strength under control. It's the ability to respond with love even in the face of provocation. Imagine a powerful horse, tamed and under control. That's the kind of strength Jesus values, a strength that transforms the world, not through confrontation, but through compassion. And so Jesus continues to build a completely different vision of life. His words challenge us, but they also inspire us to seek something greater, something more meaningful than what the world offers. If this content has already begun to resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us reach more people with messages that can transform lives. Now let's continue this journey through the Sermon on the Mount. As the Sermon on the Mount continues, Jesus takes us even deeper into profound reflections with the next Beatitudes. He declares, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Matthew 5, verse 6. Here, Jesus is not talking about a casual or superficial desire for a better world. He's speaking of a deep longing, like physical hunger or thirst for justice and righteousness. It's a call to action to actively seek change that reflects the values of God's kingdom. Next, he emphasizes the importance of mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Matthew 5, verse 7. In a world that often celebrates revenge and delights in seeing the mighty fall, Jesus invites us to choose compassion. Mercy, as he teaches, is not just a feeling but a concrete action. It's forgiving when we have every reason to hold a grudge, extending a hand when it would be easier to turn away. Jesus then raises the bar even higher by saying, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Matthew 5:8. Here, he goes beyond external appearances and speaks of integrity. To be pure in heart means to be authentic, to be the same person in public and in private. In a world full of masks and pretensions, this call to authenticity is as revolutionary today as it was 2,000 years ago. We then encounter one of his most powerful declarations, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Matthew 5:9. It's not hard to imagine the impact of these words in a society filled with conflict and divisions, much like the world we live in today. Being a peacemaker doesn't mean simply avoiding fights, but actively seeking reconciliation, healing broken relationships, and bringing harmony where there's chaos. Finally, Jesus ends the Beatitudes with a challenge that may seem strange at first. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5 verse 10. He acknowledges that living by the values of the kingdom won't be easy. The path of righteousness can attract opposition and suffering. Yet, he reminds us that these challenges are temporary and that the ultimate reward is eternal. After presenting these transformative truths, Jesus shifts to discussing the impact his followers should have on the world. He uses two simple yet powerful metaphors, salt of the earth and light of the world. You are the salt of the earth, he says. Salt not only preserves but enhances flavor. Similarly, Jesus' disciples are called to preserve the kingdom's values in a morally deteriorating world. They are meant to bring flavor, to make a difference wherever they are. Then, he calls us the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. Matthew 5, 14-15. Jesus challenges us to shine, to live in a way that makes our faith visible and inspires others. It's not about flaunting good deeds for personal glory, but reflecting God's light so others may be drawn to him. These words carry tremendous weight. They are not just an invitation, but a responsibility. Jesus reminds us that living according to his teachings is not just for our benefit, but to transform the world around us. As we continue to explore the Sermon on the Mount, we realize that Jesus is not merely sharing abstract principles. He is offering a practical and revolutionary vision for how we can live our lives in a way that impacts the world. As the Sermon on the Mount progresses, Jesus begins to directly challenge the value systems and religious practices of his time. He isn't just offering new ideas, he's confronting deeply ingrained concepts. Jesus declares, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Matthew 5 verse 38-39. For many in the crowd, these words must have been shocking. Revenge was not only accepted, but often expected. It was a way to settle scores and restore honor. But Jesus proposes something completely different. Turning the other cheek doesn't mean being passive or allowing injustice. It means breaking the cycle of violence and retaliation, responding to evil with kindness, and transforming the dynamics of conflict. Imagine how our lives could change if instead of holding on to grudges, we chose forgiveness. Instead of repaying evil for evil, we chose peace. It's an act of courage, not weakness. And then Jesus takes it even further. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Matthew 5, 44-45. This is, without a doubt, one of Jesus' most radical commands. Loving those who love us is easy, but loving our enemies? Praying for those who hurt us? This goes against every natural human instinct. Jesus explains that this attitude reflects God's character, who causes the sun to rise on both the evil and the good, and sends rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous. He calls us to a higher standard of love, one that transcends the ordinary and mirrors divine grace. Next, Jesus addresses the issue of religious hypocrisy, something that remains relevant even today. He warns, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them." Matthew 6:1. He's not condemning good deeds, but the wrong motivations behind them. Doing good to receive human applause misses the point of true righteousness. Instead, he encourages us to seek the approval of God, who sees what is done in secret. In another pivotal moment, Jesus teaches us how to pray. He gives us the model of the Lord's Prayer, which begins with, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." Notice the intimacy and reverence in this prayer. Jesus teaches us to approach God as a loving Father while recognizing his holiness and sovereignty. "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." These words are a commitment. We are asking for God's will, not ours, to be done, and for his kingdom, his way of doing things, to prevail in our lives and the world around us. It's a deep surrender. Then comes a simple yet essential request. "Give us today our daily bread." Here, Jesus reminds us to trust God to provide for our daily needs. It's not a call to passivity, but to dependence on a Father who cares for us. The prayer continues with one of the most challenging teachings of all. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Matthew 6:12. Jesus directly connects the forgiveness we receive with the forgiveness we extend. He challenges us to release grudges, not because the other person deserves it, but because we ourselves have been forgiven. Finally, the prayer concludes with, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Jesus acknowledges our vulnerability and encourages us to seek divine help to resist trials and overcome evil. Through these words, Jesus not only gives us a model for prayer, but also a guide for life. He shows us how to live in relationship with God, with others, and even with ourselves, all grounded in trust, forgiveness, and dependence. After teaching about the power of prayer and the need for a life of integrity, Jesus shifts his focus to something that affects everyone: our priorities. He declares, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." Matthew 6:19-20. With these words, Jesus challenges us to reflect on where we invest our time, energy, and resources. He's not saying it's wrong to have possessions, but that our possessions shouldn't possess us. When we place our value in material things, we're building our lives on a fragile foundation. Instead, he invites us to focus on the eternal, on treasures that cannot be destroyed. Then he makes a statement that hits at the core of our being. "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6:21. This verse compels us to ask, what do we truly value? Where is our heart? Because what we treasure defines our priorities and ultimately shapes who we are. Jesus continues by addressing our relationship with wealth. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew 6:24. He isn't condemning money itself, but warning that an obsession with it can become an idol in our lives, taking God's place. This warning is especially poignant in a world where we're often measured by what we own. Then, Jesus touches on an issue we all face: anxiety. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" Matthew 6:25. Jesus acknowledges that worry is a natural part of life, but he encourages us to trust God. To illustrate his point, he uses examples from nature. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Matthew 6:26. He also mentions the lilies of the field, which grow effortlessly and are more beautifully adorned than King Solomon in all his splendor. These images remind us that God is a caring Father who knows our needs and is willing to provide for them. This is not an invitation to passivity or irresponsibility, but a call to trust. When we let anxiety dominate our lives, we often forget that there's a sovereign God who cares for us. Jesus concludes this section with a powerful verse: "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Matthew 6:33. Here, he offers a radical shift in perspective. Instead of worrying about what's out of our control, we should focus our efforts on seeking God's will, trusting that he will take care of our needs. This is a profound change in priorities. It's not that our daily needs aren't important, but when we put God first, our vision changes. We see life with greater clarity and purpose, and the worries that once seemed overwhelming begin to lose their weight. Finally, Jesus gives us practical advice. "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Matthew 6:34. This verse reminds us to live one day at a time, trusting God to handle the future. These teachings invite us to rethink how we deal with life's pressures and anxieties, pointing us toward a path of trust and reliance on God. As the Sermon on the Mount continues, Jesus introduces one of his most well-known and challenging teachings: judgment. He begins by saying, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Matthew 7, 1-2. This teaching is often misunderstood. Jesus isn't telling us to abandon all sense of discernment or morality. What he condemns is hypocritical and arrogant judgment. How often do we point out the flaws in others while ignoring our own? It's this tendency that Jesus confronts. He uses a vivid metaphor to make his point. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Matthew 7. Imagine someone trying to remove a tiny speck from another's eye while carrying a massive beam in their own. It's almost comical, but it reveals a profound truth. Jesus is saying, before correcting others, examine yourself. This doesn't mean we should never help someone address their faults. On the contrary, Jesus encourages us to do so, but with humility and grace. He concludes, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Matthew 7, 5. It's a call to practice self-reflection before pointing fingers at others. Next, Jesus presents one of his most foundational teachings, the Golden Rule. He says, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." Matthew 7, verse 12. This principle is incredibly simple, but profoundly transformative. It's not just about avoiding harm. It's about taking the initiative to do good. It invites us to put ourselves in others' shoes and act with kindness and empathy. Imagine how our communities, workplaces, and relationships would change if we truly lived out the Golden Rule. Jesus then warns us about the paths we choose in life. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Matthew 7, 13-14. Here, Jesus presents us with a clear choice: the easy and popular path that leads to destruction, or the narrow, often difficult path that leads to life. The narrow path isn't easy because it requires discipline, self-denial, and courage. Yet, it's the path that leads to true peace and fulfillment. Finally, Jesus addresses the importance of true obedience and spiritual fruitfulness. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Matthew 7:21. This reminds us that genuine faith isn't about words alone, but actions. It's not enough to profess belief in God. We must live according to his teachings. Jesus also warns against false prophets, saying, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves." Matthew 7, verse 15. He teaches us to evaluate people and their teachings by the fruit they produce. By their fruit, you will recognize them. Matthew 7:16. These words encourage us to remain vigilant, discerning what is true and false, not by eloquence or appearance, but by the evidence of transformed lives. As we continue to unravel the Sermon on the Mount, we see that every teaching from Jesus is not just a reflection for the mind, but an invitation to action. He challenges us to live differently, to build our lives on solid and eternal foundations. Jesus concludes the Sermon on the Mount with one of his most memorable and powerful analogies, the story of the two builders. He begins by saying, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock." Matthew 7:24-25. Here, Jesus draws a vivid contrast between two ways of living. Building a house on the rock symbolizes a life grounded in obedience to his teachings. The rock represents a firm, unshakable foundation that can withstand life's inevitable storms. The rains, floods, and winds are metaphors for the challenges we all face: loss, disappointment, temptation, and suffering. On the other hand, Jesus warns, "But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Matthew 7:26-27. The sand represents everything unstable and fleeting. Building on sand means basing our lives on superficial values, such as materialism, pride, or selfishness. It may seem easier or quicker at first, but when the storms of life come, a foundation built on sand will inevitably collapse. This parable is not just a story, it's a call to action. Jesus doesn't merely invite us to listen to his words, he commands us to live them out. The wise builder is the one who takes Jesus' teachings to heart and applies them in daily life. But what does it mean in practical terms to build our lives on the rock? It means placing God at the center of our decisions, treating others with love and compassion, seeking justice and righteousness, trusting God in uncertain times, and prioritizing eternal values over temporary gains. It's not just about believing, it's about living. The story of the two builders also reminds us of an important truth. Storms come to everyone. Both the man who built on the rock and the man who built on the sand faced rains, floods, and winds. Jesus never promises a storm-free life for his followers, but he does promise that those who build on him will have the strength to endure and overcome. As Jesus finishes his sermon, the Gospel of Matthew tells us, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Matthew 7:28-29. This reaction is significant. Unlike the religious leaders of the time, who often focused on external rules and traditions, Jesus spoke with divine authority, addressing the heart and offering a transformative way of living. His words weren't just a set of laws, they were a vision of life as it was meant to be, full of purpose, peace, and a deep connection with God. The Sermon on the Mount is not simply a collection of moral principles. It's an invitation to a radical transformation of heart and mind. Jesus calls us to swim against the current, to reject the shallow values of the world, and to embrace a life rooted in love, humility, and truth. As we reflect on this teaching, the question we must ask ourselves is, what foundation are we building our lives on? Are we building on the rock of Christ's teachings, or are we settling for the shifting sands of temporary satisfaction? The choice is ours, and Jesus leaves no room for ambiguity. The wise builder hears and acts. The foolish builder hears, but does nothing. The storms of life are inevitable, but the outcome depends on the foundation we choose. As we delve further into the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins to challenge us to put these teachings into practice. His words are not just abstract ideals, they are a call to action, a guide for building lives that reflect the values of God's kingdom. Let's start with one of the most radical teachings. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. At first glance, this seems nearly impossible. How can we love those who hurt us, betray us, or seek to harm us? Yet, Jesus calls us to do exactly that. Loving our enemies doesn't mean condoning their behavior or ignoring justice. It means choosing to break the cycle of hatred and retaliation. It means praying for their transformation and well-being, even when it feels undeserved. Imagine how our world could change if, instead of seeking revenge, we responded with compassion. This kind of love reflects the character of God, who, as Jesus reminds us, causes the sun to rise on both the good and the evil, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Next, Jesus gives us a principle that can transform our relationships. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Matthew 7:12. Known as the Golden Rule, this teaching is deceptively simple yet profoundly powerful. It's not just about refraining from harm, it's about actively seeking to do good. It's an invitation to empathy, to step into another person's shoes and treat them as we would want to be treated. Think about how this could look in your daily life. In your workplace, it might mean offering encouragement to a struggling colleague. In your family, it could mean showing patience instead of frustration. In society, it's about acting with kindness and fairness, even when it's inconvenient. The Golden Rule challenges us to move beyond self-interest and live with intentionality and love. Jesus then warns us about the choices we make in life. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Matthew 7:13-14. This is a stark reminder that the path to true life is not always the easiest or most popular. The broad road may appear attractive because it's filled with comfort, indulgence, and shortcuts, but it ultimately leads to emptiness. The narrow road, on the other hand, requires sacrifice, discipline, and perseverance. Yet, It's the road that leads to eternal fulfillment and peace. Finally, Jesus addresses the importance of living a life that bears fruit. He says, "By their fruit you will recognize them." Matthew 7:16. This teaching reminds us that our actions reveal the true condition of our hearts. It's not enough to claim faith or speak eloquently about it. The evidence of our beliefs is seen in how we live. Think about the kind of fruit your life is producing. Are your actions reflecting love, kindness, and patience? Are you using your gifts to serve others and glorify God? Jesus challenges us to evaluate our lives and ensure that we are living in alignment with his teachings. These lessons from the Sermon on the Mount remind us that following Jesus is a daily commitment. It's not about perfection, but about progress, taking small, consistent steps toward living out his values. When we choose to love, to forgive, to seek justice, and to walk the narrow road, we are building lives that stand firm on the rock of his word. As the Sermon on the Mount progresses, Jesus brings us to one of the most practical yet profound aspects of his teachings: living with a focus on eternal values rather than temporary concerns. He begins by addressing something that resonates deeply with all of us: anxiety. "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" Matthew 6:25. Jesus isn't dismissing the importance of these things. Rather, he is inviting us to shift our perspective. Worry often arises from a sense of control or lack thereof. Jesus reminds us that our lives are in the hands of a loving and sovereign God. To illustrate this, he points to nature. "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" Matthew 6:26. It's a simple yet profound reminder of God's care. If he provides for the birds, how much more will he care for us, his children? Jesus continues with another striking image. "See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these." Matthew 6:28-29. Flowers, fleeting as they are, display a beauty that reflects God's creative care. If he clothes them so extravagantly, how much more will he provide for us? But Jesus doesn't stop at addressing our worries about daily needs. He challenges us to reorient our entire approach to life. "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Matthew 6:33. This is a call to prioritize what truly matters: God's will, his purposes, and his way of living. When we align our lives with these priorities, the rest falls into place. This teaching is both liberating and challenging. It invites us to trust God fully, letting go of the constant striving and worry that often consume our days. But it also requires us to examine where our focus lies. Are we seeking first his kingdom, or are we distracted by the temporary and superficial? Jesus concludes this section with a piece of wisdom that feels especially relevant in today's fast-paced world. "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Matthew 6:34. This is not an encouragement to neglect planning or responsibility, but a reminder to live in the present. By focusing on today, we can fully trust God for what lies ahead. Beyond addressing anxiety, Jesus shifts to the topic of how we interact with others, emphasizing humility and empathy. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Matthew 7:1. Here, Jesus warns against a critical and self-righteous attitude. Instead of pointing out the faults of others, he invites us to examine our own hearts first. He uses a vivid and almost humorous metaphor. "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Matthew 7:3. It's a powerful image that underscores the hypocrisy of focusing on others' flaws while ignoring our own. Jesus' point is clear. Before we help others, we must first address our own shortcomings. This humility extends to how we approach all relationships. Jesus invites us to treat others with the same grace and compassion we desire. "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you." Matthew 7:12. This golden rule isn't just a moral ideal, it's a practical guide for transforming how we live and interact with those around us. These teachings remind us that the Sermon on the Mount isn't just about lofty ideals. It's about the everyday choices that shape who we are and how we live. When we focus on God's kingdom, trust in His care, and treat others with humility and love, we lay the foundation for a life that truly reflects His values. As the Sermon on the Mount reaches its conclusion, Jesus leaves us with one of His most impactful parables, the story of the two builders. It's a profound metaphor that encapsulates the essence of everything He has taught. Jesus begins, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." Matthew 7:24. Here, the rock represents a life grounded in obedience to Jesus' teachings. Building on the rock is not simply about listening or agreeing with His words. It's about living them out. It's about allowing His truth to shape our decisions, priorities, and relationships. He continues, "The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock." Matthew 7:25. The storms symbolize the inevitable challenges of life: loss, disappointment, temptation, and hardship. Jesus assures us that when our lives are built on the solid foundation of His Word, we can withstand these trials without being shaken. In contrast, Jesus warns, "But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Matthew 7:26-27. The sand represents everything unstable and temporary. Building on sand might seem easier or more convenient at first. It's the path of least resistance. But when the storms come, a foundation built on sand will inevitably collapse. This parable is a sobering reminder that a life without obedience to Jesus' teachings is ultimately unsustainable. What's striking about this parable is that both builders face the same external conditions. The storms come to everyone, regardless of where their foundation lies. The difference lies in the outcome. One house stands firm, while the other falls. Jesus doesn't promise a life free from difficulty, but He does promise the strength and stability to endure when we build our lives on Him. This teaching invites us to reflect deeply. What foundation are we building our lives on? Are we prioritizing eternal values or temporary comforts? Are we putting Jesus' words into practice, or are we merely hearing them without action? Living according to Jesus' teachings requires intentionality. It means forgiving when it's easier to hold a grudge, loving our enemies when revenge feels justified, and seeking God's kingdom above our own ambitions. It's a daily commitment to choose the narrow path, even when it's difficult or countercultural. The Gospel of Matthew concludes this portion with a powerful observation. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at His teaching, because He taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Matthew 7, verse 28-29. This amazement wasn't just about the content of Jesus' message, it was about the way He delivered it. Unlike the religious leaders of His time, who often focused on external rituals and rules, Jesus spoke with divine authority, offering a vision of life that touched both the heart and the mind. The Sermon on the Mount is more than a collection of moral principles. It's an invitation to live differently, to build a life rooted in love, humility, and trust in God. It's a call to action that challenges us to move beyond mere words and into a life of transformative obedience. As we reflect on these teachings, the question remains, what will we do with them? The choice is ours. Will we be wise builders, laying our foundation on the rock of Christ's word, or will we settle for the shifting sands of worldly priorities? As we conclude this journey through the Sermon on the Mount, it's clear that Jesus wasn't just teaching. He was inviting us to embrace a completely new way of living. His words challenge us to rethink our priorities, reshape our relationships, and rebuild our lives on a foundation that cannot be shaken. The Sermon on the Mount is not merely a list of rules. It's a vision of what life can look like when God's kingdom takes center stage. It's an invitation to a life marked by love, humility, forgiveness, and trust in God's provision. But now, the question is, what will we do with these teachings? Jesus ends His sermon with a call to action. It's not enough to admire His words or agree with them intellectually. True transformation happens when we put them into practice. take a moment to reflect. In what areas of your life are you already building on the rock of Jesus' teachings, and where might you still be relying on the shifting sands of temporary values? Whether it's in your relationships, your priorities, or your approach to challenges, now is the time to realign with the truths Jesus shared. Let's remember, Jesus never promised an easy path. The storms will come, but the foundation we choose will determine whether we stand firm or fall. By living out his teachings, we not only find stability for ourselves, but also become a light to others, showing the power of a life rooted in God. If this message has inspired or challenged you, take the next step. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these timeless truths. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more transformative content. Before you go, check out the video on the screen now. It's another deep dive into the teachings of Jesus that will leave you even more inspired and equipped for the journey of faith. Thank you for being with us today, and may God bless you as you seek to live a life built on the solid rock of His Word. Until next time.